Hi, my name's Christine Sotelo with New Relic, and I'd like to take a couple minutes of your time to go over transaction traces with you in more detail. Transaction traces replace the time-consuming task of digging through log files by providing you code-level diagnostics down to the SQL. It is truly one of the most powerful components of New Relic. So let's get started. After signing into your account, you will be directed to the application dashboard, where you will see the list of your applications. You can go ahead and click on one of these applications. I will choose the New Relic RPM UI application for this example. Now that I've clicked on the RPM UI application, you see that I'm taken to the Monitoring Overview page. This page gives you a high-level overview of your application performance. We can see here the app server response time, AppDex score, throughput, error rate, events, and a section over here titled Web Transactions. Now you can see listed here 5 different app server web transactions with their corresponding app server response times. If I were to toggle over to the browser side, you would see the top 5 browser web transactions and their corresponding browser response times. I'm going to stay here on the app server web transaction side for the purpose of this demonstration. So a few things that are important to point out here. The top portion of this overview screen shows you the app server response times as a graph over time. This graph represents average aggregated app server response times over a period of time, and in this case it's in the last 30 minutes. We can adjust this time period up here from anywhere between 30 minutes and 3 months. Well, another great feature to point out here is if I'm looking at this graph during this 30-minute window and I see an area with a spike, like here, I can drag my mouse across the spike and narrow down the time window like this. And now we're looking at a 3-minute time window. This graph also emphasizes where calls to the app server spend most of their time. So here you can see the most time is spent in the Ruby code. If you look below again to the top 5 app server web transactions, these transactions are specific transactions that have taken place in the last 3 minutes, and they are ranked by which are the busiest and slowest. So here you can see that this top transaction, Applications Controller, took about 1.3 seconds. We know that this is quite slow compared to the average time of 218 milliseconds, which can be seen here above the graph. Before I dive further into these transaction traces, it's also important to understand how we capture these traces and what it means if they're showing up here. So let's go here to Settings and click on Application. This will take us to an area where we can choose our settings for this particular application, in this case RPM UI. If we scroll down, we can see that our transaction tracing is enabled and our threshold is set to 0.4, which means that any transactions that exceed this value will be traced, and from there we will take the slowest, busiest transactions and bring them to your attention. And that's what's being displayed here. Before we click on the web transaction link here to show us an extended list of our web transactions, I'll point out that you can access the same information by clicking on web transactions up here at the top of the page. So let's do it. Here we are showing you a list of web transactions that are flowing through the system over the last 3-minute period, ranked by the most time consuming. You can choose to sort by whatever parameters best suit you. However, most time consuming is a great indicator of which transactions are the busiest and responding the slowest. So for this demonstration, I will leave it here on most time consuming. We can quickly drill down into any one of these transactions here on the left. As I showed you before, you can easily toggle back and forth between application data and the real user data, which is called the browser. However, for this demonstration, I'll stay here on the app server side and we can dig into a transaction trace from here. So now to dig deeper into one of these transactions, I will simply click on the slowest transaction here at the top. From here we can see a graph representing where most of the time is being spent on average in this 3-minute time frame. We capture all segments that go through this one particular transaction, and it's important to remember that this graph is an on-average aggregate of the data from all the servers reporting in. Directly below the graph are the slowest instances of the transaction. You can see the total time of each instance as well as the exact time it happened. We can see that the first instance of this transaction has taken 12.8 seconds to complete, and when we look above to compare that to the average of 669 milliseconds, we can see it's taking a lot longer than the average. We now want to drill down to see what is causing this transaction to be so much longer than the average. So we click on the specific trace. Now we're looking at one individual transaction that went through the system, so we're no longer looking at an average or aggregate data. We now have a detailed overview of the transaction. We can see how long the response time was, what the CPU burn time was, and we have an overview of which components are the slowest, both in the graph view as well as listed below. We can see here by looking at the graph that a large percentage of time was spent in the incident SQL select. And when we look below at the slowest component section, we see that the events find was called 200 times, also taking a large percentage of the time. In order to find out exactly where the bottlenecks are, we can click here on Trace Details to dig a little bit deeper. Here we can see the order of code execution. So in the code we can see where things are slowing down and where the bottlenecks are occurring. And now we have a breakdown of all details of a specific trace, listing the different calls and where the most time was spent. The new Relic tool identifies the areas of concern by coloring them in red or gold. We are looking at a couple different database queries here that are taking place. We can see highlighted some areas that are taking a particularly long time, so we can open the drill down to see the exact line of code of that database query. We can also see some areas where there is a high number of method calls and determine if that is normal or if it's slowing down the transaction. From here, you're able to make adjustments to your code to speed up this area of your application for faster performance. So that's a quick overview of how you find and use transaction traces. We hope this was helpful, and we hope you now start diving into your code.